What's going on, guys? It's Cooper Codes, and in this video we are going to be building this SvelteKit e-commerce store using SvelteKit 1.0, the Stripe API, and Skeleton UI. We're going to be able to add and remove certain items from our cart, and then we're going to be able to check out with Stripe. As you'll see, our Stripe cart matches exactly what was on the previous website. We can then type in some test data and press pay. We will then get sent to a success route, which means our payment was successful. Over on our Stripe payments, you'll see a payment from that specific person. We can go in here and see who the customer is and also all the different items they purchased. This is a great beginner level project because we're using an external styling to make the website. We're using a SvelteKit store to manage all the different data for our cart. And then we're integrating the Stripe API on the server side. And then we're doing some very basic routing with the cancel routes and also the success routes. Let's get into building this project. For this video, we're going to be using the Skeleton UI framework. Skeleton UI is a great UI library, but also makes things very simple when it comes to creating your applications. We can use this command here, npm create skeleton app, to make our app work with skeleton right away. So we can copy this. I'm then going to go to an empty folder in Visual Studio Code and paste that command in. So npm create skeleton-app at latest, and I'm just going to call it my-app. I'm going to use type checking with TypeScript syntax, so we can press that option. I'm going to say yes to ESLint, yes to prettier, no to playwright, and no to vittest. I'm also going to say no to enabling this experimental feature. Just to make the tutorial simple, I'm going to press A here to toggle all these different optional Tailwind plugins and then press enter. Skeleton UI has a bunch of different themes. I'm just going to use the skeleton theme for this video. So just press enter, and I'm going to opt for the bare bones so I can show you guys how to build stuff from scratch. One important thing before we get started is you're going to want to make sure to look up Svelte for VS Code. This is going to give you syntax highlighting for Svelte files. We can then cd into the my app folder that just got created over here. I know that this folder structure is a little bit intense, but everything that we're going to be doing in this video is going to be happening inside the source folder. Inside the source folder, we have the lib folder here, which is where we can store things like components. And then we also have the routes. So inside this route, we'll see the layout.svelte and then the page.svelte. And so if we go to the base root of our application, we're going to see this page alongside this layout. So you can see this initial page right here by going into npm run dev, and you can press control click on this to open this link up. And you'll see we have this pretty basic text that's just default and skeleton. Let's get started by building out the user interface for this project. I'm going to keep this container here because I like the styling of everything being centered to the middle. But inside of the middle of our web page, we can make a grid, which is using some Tailwind classes. So we can define this div as a grid by making its first class name grid, and then we can do some customization to the grid itself. So for example, the grid calls 3 means that this grid is going to have 3 different columns. And between each column, I'm going to have a gap with a length of 4. Now we can make a div that's going to span over 3 different columns. We can do this by saying div class is equal to call-span-3. So this is going to take up the whole row because this grid has 3 columns per row. And this column here is spanning over 3 different columns. And so inside of here, I'm just going to put a simple h1 saying SvelteKit 1.0 store. And you'll see so far so good. Now let's add a button so we can check out. So the button, I'm going to do the same exact thing. So let's copy this code over. So on the bottom of our screen, the button will get its own full row. And we can initialize the button like this. And we'll say check out with Stripe API. We can apply some styling to the button by saying class is equal to, give it the default button class by giving it btn like this. And then we can do some styling beyond just the default button. For example, the variant of filled-primary, which is going to give it a green color. And there we go. We have a nice clickable button. One thing that we need now is all of our different cards to show off each product. Because every single product is going to have its own card, so you can imagine it's going to be like card 1, card 2, card 3, all over the place, right? We are going to make this into a component. We can make a Svelte component by going over to our lib folder here and creating the name of the component. For example, ProductCard.Svelte. Inside of here, we can write any HTML just like usual. For example, I'm going to make a div and its class is going to be equal to card. We can then make a header for this specific card and its class is going to be equal to card-header. And inside the header will be an h2, so kind of like a subheader showing off the product name. And so we're going to make it a little bit more complicated than this, but let's go back over to our page. And at the top here, we can make a script, and its language is going to be specifically TypeScript. And then we can import the specific component like this, product card, and it's going to be from $lib/productcard.svelte. And so now down here, we can introduce the product card by going product card, just like this. And inside of our application, we will now see whatever is within the product card right here. So let's go check it out. Amazing. So it's still missing some detail, but at least we know that the component is being shown to our SvelteKit application correctly. Let's go back and finish this card component. I'm going to make a div here, which is going to be class is equal to card dash body. Then I'm going to do some padding in the X direction with the size of 4 is what px-4 means. It's then going to say that the price is equal to, let's just say $10 here. Eventually, we're going to have some data where we can show a specific product's name and a specific price. But for here, we're just going to show hard-coded stuff first. Above the price, I'm going to add another div, which is going to be class of card-body and px-4 again. Inside of here, I'm going to show our quantity. So for example, quantity is going to be a strong tag here, so it kind of stands out. Let's just say we have 4 in our cart right now. We can then add a footer to our card like this, so the stuff that's at the bottom of the card, and its class is going to be equal to card-footer. This is where we can have our buttons to add or remove to cart. So button, I'm going to say it's equal to p-2, so just padding around it. It's going to be rounded, and I like this kind of variant -glass, so that's a certain button variant you can use. And I'm going to say dash primary, which means a green color. And so since it's green, I'm going to say add to cart. And then same thing here, except I'm going to do glass dash error, which is going to give like a red color. So that's going to be the remove from cart. Let's go check out how this looks. All right, this product card looks great. Now I'm going to hard code some data that's going to allow us to have a bunch of different products in our website. Let's go over to our main page.svelte here. And then we can make an array of products in our store. So I'm going to make it a const because remember, this is the products we're selling and it's not like our cart or anything. So we're not going to have that change. Products is going to be equal to an array. And remember guys, this is a TypeScript tutorial. And so we can actually type this products array as a product array like this, except you'll see we don't have product defined yet. And so where do you define types in SvelteKit? We can go over to the app.d.ts. This is where we're going to have all the different interfaces related to our SvelteKit application. Under this namespace app, we can also do our own classes. For example, declare class product. Our products are going to have an ID, which is going to be a string. So you could imagine like your Stripe ID, which we'll get into when we do the Stripe stuff, and also a name, which is going to be a string, and then a price, which is going to be a number. So you can imagine coffee or something simple, and then price is going to be like 5. And now we've fully defined our product, which is great news. If we go back over to our page.svelte, you'll see no more errors, which is great news. And so now we can start by making some objects, which are going to represent the different products in our website. Because we're using TypeScript, check this out. When I start typing ID, it's going to show me that ID is a property of product and it's expected to be a string. So just for testing, I'm going to make these IDs like 1, 2, 3, 4. Eventually this will be a real ID connected to a real way to pay for it. Its name, this one I'm just going to make coffee, and its price is going to be 5. And you'll see all of those errors finally go away when this object matches the actual expected types for a product. And so let's just make some more products here. The next one I'm going to call sunglasses, and make sure to change its ID to something unique. If you have the same IDs here, some stuff might break for you. So be careful that these are all ID 1, 2, 3 is what I would recommend. And let's make this sunglasses. We have a price of 10. And the third one is going to be a water bottle, which I'm going to give a price of 15. And so now we're running into a problem. We want this products array to show a bunch of different products on our website, right? There's going to be a couple of things we have to do. First thing we can do is we can make an each loop. We can say each products as product. This means we're going into the products array that we defined at line 4 here. And at each iteration, we are looking at that specific object as product. So for example, looking at just this own object here as just the product variable here. And so we can get access to the specific object. To end our each loop, we can say /each like this. And so it's going to loop through every single product in the products array and give us a product card. So let's save our website and see what that looks like so far. You'll see it's smart enough to know that there are 3 different things in our array, But one very important thing we need to do is we need to pass this product into the product card component. So you could imagine the first card should have all of that first object's data. That second card should have all the second object's data, and same thing with the third card. And so we can pass in that object as a property. Properties are pretty simple in SvelteKit. So we can say product is equal to, so the product property is equal to an object of product. And now it's going to yell at us because we never told it that it's expecting a certain property. We can make a property by going over to the product card, making a TypeScript script at the top, so script type is equal to TypeScript. And to define properties, you do an export let product. It's kind of strange, but this is how you pretty much define properties in SvelteKit. You say export let product. We can also type the property to a product like this, and then we can set a default value for what we expect this property to be. For example, I'm just going to make it an ID of nothing, a name of nothing, and then a price of 0. Oh, and my bad, guys. I was talking about types. It should be lang is equal to ts right there. And so now we're good to go. And so we can add a console.log product to see what the product property currently is. So if we refresh our SvelteKit application, we'll see that every single card now has its respective object. And so we can display these different properties throughout the component. And so for the product name, we can change that to product, the actual object, dot name. The quantity is going to have to do with our cart system. So we're not going to change this quite yet. I'm going to change the price to the product dot price. And you'll see with these curly braces, you can add in that product wherever you want. And we're not going to be using the product ID anywhere in the component here. So let's go back over to our application. You'll see we now have the name and the price for every single component here, which is great news. And so one important thing here is that we now need to work with a store or some type of state management to actually make the cart system where we can see how many things are in our cart. We can get started by creating our Svelte store by going into the source folder at the highest level and making a cart.TypeScript. This is similar to React context if you've ever worked with that, except it's kind of a little bit more simple. We can start by importing a very important thing called a writable. This is a way to store variables inside of SvelteKit, and it's coming from the specific library svelte/store. And we have to use the get as well, because get is what helps us get the value out of a store. And so the store itself is actually going to be very simple. We can say export const cart items. So all the different items in our cart is going to be equal to a writable that is going to be an empty array. And so this cart items, to give you guys an example, is going to be an array like this. And every single slot in the array is going to be an object which represents an item in our cart. The item is going to have an ID, which is going to be that stripe ID, and then also a quantity, which is going to be a number. For example, we have 4 total things that are of the ID 1. And just for example's sake, I'm going to copy this over and say for ID 2, we only have 1 thing. Because we know we want the array to be this specific structure, we can add in types to this writable. So it's typed to only have objects like this. So what did we learn about types? We learned that we can go over to app.d.ts to make a class. And so we can declare a class of cart item. And it's going to be an object with what 2 properties we saw before. It was that ID that's going to be a string, and then a quantity, which is going to be a number. Let's go back over to our cart code here, and we can use some pointy brackets here to define the writable's type. So for this type, we want it to be a cart item array. This means that any object inside this array that we write to needs to be in the format of this specific type here. And so SvelteKit allows you to make functions that can change the value of this writable. For example, we can make an add to cart function and a remove from cart function. So it's just going to add one or remove one. And so what this will do is it will change the value of the writable to do whatever it does. For example, removing it or adding to the cart. So to create an add to cart, what we can do is you can say export const add to cart is equal to, so some arrow syntax here, an ID of a string. So we're going to add a item with a specific ID to our cart. And so if we want to get the items that are currently in our cart, you might think like, oh, let's just use cart items like this. But an important thing to understand with SvelteKit state management is that cart items is a writable, not a value, if that makes sense. And so to get the value out of the writable, we can say get cart items, which is going to give us the array like up here. So for this add to cart, I'm going to say let items is equal to get cart items. And so when adding to a cart, we can run into two different situations. The first situation is item is not in the cart at all. So add the object to the cart. The second situation is item is already in cart, add to the quantity of that item. So if we look at the array right here, for example, if I were the code and I wanted to add, let's say ID is 1, and I wanted to add an item to 1, I would go in here and I would see that ID of 1 already exists, and so I would change the quantity of 4 to the quantity of 5. If I wanted to add an ID of 3, for example, the code would say, okay, no ID of 3 is in here, right? It's only 1 and 2. So we'd have to go in and add a whole new object over here, setting its ID equal to 3, and its initial quantity equal to 1. And so that's pretty much what our code's going to do. So in order to see if a ID of 1 exists in our cart, for example, we can get the item's position. So we can say let item position be equal to items. So remember, that's this array here, dot find the index of a certain element. What find index does is it will take a look at every single item. So it will map over every single item and it will tell you the first item that reaches a certain condition. And so that condition is going to return if the item.id is equal to the ID that we're looking for in the parameters here. For example, does the current item have an ID of 1? And so as soon as it does, it's going to return us the index of where that item is. If it doesn't exist, the item position is going to be -1. So we can say if item position does not equal -1, we then know that the item is in the cart. And so we can take this comment and even put it in here like this. And then we can make an else statement showing that the item is not in the cart. And so we do that logic. I'm actually going to do this else statement first as it's more simple logic. So I'm going to say cart items dot update. As you'll see, we're actually updating the writable. And so this update here is what allows us to change the value of the writable. This then takes an updater callback function. So we can use the callback function by defining a logic like this. Inside the callback function, we are going to return an array. Inside this array, we can take all the different items that are inside cart items, for example, the ones we saved right here, and then add another item on top. For example, an item with the ID of ID that we passed in above, and an initial quantity of 1. So it's going to take all the items here and put them at the front of our array, and then add one more object to the end of our array that has a quantity of 1. So our new object adding to the cart. And so we can copy this cart items.update here because we're going to use it again to update over here. Except in this case, we're going to make a new array that I'm going to be calling let updated items. And for this array, we are going to map over the items array by saying items.map. What map does is it loops through every single thing in the array. So for example, every single item in the array. At each item, we're going to ask a simple question. If the item.id is equal to the ID that we're looking for, then return all the properties of that item is what ... item is, and then overwrite the quantity by taking the current item we're at by saying item.quantity and then adding 1 to it. So like +1. And so if the item is not the one that we're trying to add to, it's not the ID that we passed in above, we can just return the item here. And so this is going to build an array, is what updated items is going to become, is it's going to become that new updated array where all the objects are going to be the same except for that one object that we add to, like this, if we add it to the quantity. Because updated items is our array, we can then return updated items down here. So just for one very basic example, I can show you guys this. So updated items is getting built up by this items.map, and items is an array that I'm just using as an example right here. When we map through the first item, it has an ID of 1. And in this case, let's add to the ID of 1. Because we're adding that specific ID, we're going to go into this if statement because that's the one that we're trying to add to our cart. Inside of updated items, what we're going to do is we are going to take this full object, that's what the ... item is doing, and then add 1 to its quantity. So for example, from 6, it's now going to 7. On the next iteration, we are going to ID of 2. We're not trying to add to the ID of 2. So instead of entering the if statement, we just return the item as normal. And so it would go in like this. And so now that updated items is equal to the array that we want, we can return updated items, which is going to update the cart items array to what updated items is. And I explain this in so much depth because the remove from cart is going to be very similar to what we're doing here. So add to cart is fully done. We can now go to the bottom of our file here and get started working on the remove from cart. So I'm going to say export const remove from cart is going to be equal to an ID of string, and again using some arrow function syntax. I'm going to go to add to cart and copy this initial code that gets the items and the current items position, so we can paste that in here. And so to simplify some syntax and kind of just simplify solving this problem, you can imagine that we want to delete an item that looks like this. If we remove an item from this cart like this, the quantity is going to become 0. And so we want to remove that object entirely. We can cover this case by saying if the items of item position, and then I'm going to say question mark dot quantity. And you might be like, why do we do a question mark? Well, because item position might be -1. So we can't assume that it exists. And so if this quantity -1 is equal to 0, we can then just simply say items.splice. So pretty much remove the item at its position. So at item position, and then remove only one item. And this is common syntax for just removing something from a JavaScript array. What this would do is it would take our ID of 1, be like, if we remove one quantity, it's going to become 0. And so it's pretty much removing this entire object. So it's going in here and just going like that. So you're going to have an empty array. And so I'm going to scroll back up to add to cart, and I'm going to copy this cart items.update inside that first part of the if statement. So just the cart items.update should be around line 18. And so I'm actually going to keep these comments just to show you guys an example, right? In the previous example, we actually added to 1, but now we want to remove from 1. So our updated items will hopefully look like this, where if we're removing 1, it would go from 6 to 5. And I know it seems too good to be true, but because we already covered the case of it being 0 above here, inside of this update, we can just say item.quantity -1 instead of +1. And so what this is going to do is very similar to the example above. It's going to loop through, and as soon as it sees the item that we're trying to remove, for example, if we want to remove the one with an ID of 1, it's going to look at its current quantity, 6 for example, and then do -1 to it. So it's going to make the quantity of 6 go to the quantity of 5. And remember, this is all happening in our cart items.update. And this .update is incredibly important because it is what's actually updating our writable. And so now, because we're using the export keyword in front of all these different functions, we can import them into any SvelteKit logic that we want. For example, let's go over to our ProductCard.Svelte, which is in our lib folder. We can start by importing everything we want from the actual cart store that we just made. So for example, we can get access to the cart items writable like this. And you'll see it's the writable that we exported inside of our cart.ts. And we can get access to the add to cart and the remove from cart functions that we made inside of our store. To get access to the current value of the cart, we can say let cart is equal to get cart items. And so I'm kind of showing this error on purpose. Remember that cart items is just a writable. Even inside of Svelte components, we can import get from svelte/store in order to get the actual array of cart items like this. Inside of our component, all we know is that the ID is equal to 1, for example. In order to get the index of where it is in the cart, we can say let cart item index be equal to cart.findIndex, which is going to map over all these different objects inside of the item parameter right here. And then we want to find the object where it returns the condition for item.id is equal to the product.id. So we want the ID of 1 here to be equal to the product.id. So pretty much matching up our IDs from our cart over to our product. And so then we can get access to this specific product by saying let cart product be equal to cart of cart item index. Now there's one more important thing about how state management works within Svelte. We need to look for whenever the cart items array changes. To listen to changes, we can say .subscribe, and then we can take the current value of the cart. So subscribe gives us the new value of the cart. So I can even say new cart value. We can then set our cart variable at line 5 here equal to the new cart value. And we can take these two lines and we're going to want to pretty much refresh the cart item index in case that changed, and also refresh the cart product in case that changed. This is going to allow these variables to constantly be updated with new information as our state changes. And so now in our quantity, we can actually reference the cart product .quantity like this. And when we click on the add button, what we can do is we can say on:click is equal to some curly braces, and we can point the on-click event in SvelteKit to be equal to the add to cart, and then pass in the product.id. And so this is going to pass in the product ID to the logic that we've written earlier in the tutorial. And the same logic is going to apply for removing from our cart. But instead, we're going to say remove from cart with that specific product ID. And so an important thing actually is that our cart product cannot really be assumed to be defined, because sometimes you'll have an item in your cart, for example, and sometimes you won't. And so to reference its quantity, we want to make sure to do an if statement first by saying # if cart product does not equal undefined. And we actually want to do that on the outside of this div here. Then show the quantity that we're getting from our cart state. And then we can just end our if statement right here. All right, so let's go over to our SvelteKit application and we can see these on clicks working and the quantity showing. Amazing. So we can pretty much see that when we add and remove the different items in our cart, everything's working, which is great news. In order to see what the actual array looks like, we can also do a little console.log. Add a console.log statement to the subscribe here. So whenever we get a new cart value, it's going to console.log it wherever your product cards are. And so I'm going to go in here and add a bunch of different coffees, 1 sunglasses, and then 2 water bottles. And you'll see inside of our array here, we have access to all the different things in our cart. It's showing for the ID of 1, we have a quantity of 4, ID of 2, quantity 1, ID 3, quantity 2, which is great news. Now we can work on creating the checkout with Stripe API route. So with SvelteKit, it actually has its own server-side route that we can use for things like API calls. To make routes in your API, we go into the source folder, then we go into the routes folder, and then we make a folder called API. Inside of this API, it's expecting different folders for different routes. For example, I'm going to make another folder called Stripe Checkout. And inside of Stripe Checkout, I'm going to make a file called +server.ts. This allows us to define some server-side code for this specific API route. And so we are in localhost 5173/API/Stripe checkout. And so if we call this link specifically, we're going to be able to use any handlers that we define here. For example, when we post to the /Stripe checkout, we're going to give it data, such as the items in our cart, which I'll just define as items. And it's going to return to us a URL created by Stripe for our user to use. And so let's define this logic. We can go to the top and import the type of request handler from the actual Svelte types. So $types gives us access to these SvelteKit types. And then let's close our server for a little bit because we're going to npm install Stripe. So make sure to npm install Stripe here because we're going to start working with the Stripe object in JavaScript. Now that Stripe has been installed, we can npm run dev again, and then go to the top here and import Stripe from the Stripe package like this. I'm then going to make a const called secret_stripe_key is equal to an empty string. I'm going to write this logic out first, and then I'm going to show you guys how to get your own Stripe key. It's super easy. It will just take a minute. I'm then going to say const stripe is equal to a new Stripe instance with that capital S. We're going to pass in our API key, which is just an empty string for now. And then it wants a config object as well. The main thing that's required in this config object is the API version. If you look up Stripe API latest version, it's going to allow you to access different versions of the API. And so we're going to add in this 2022 11-15 is the most recent one from recording this video. I think Stripe does this versioning stuff so like enterprise people don't get screwed over when they change API versions, but I would just recommend using the latest one. All right, so now we can actually make our handler. So in the SvelteKit API side of things, the actual handlers are defined by their names. So we can export the const post, which is the name of the handler, and it's going to be typed to request handler. And we're going to make it an asynchronous handler because we are going to be using the await keyword throughout. And in the parameters, we're going to get access to the request. And this is an arrow function that's going to point to logic like this. And this post is going to have an error for a little bit because it's expecting a certain return statement because of the request handler we typed it to. In our front end, we are going to pass in some data to our request. And under the items, we are going to have our actual items like this. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to say const data is equal to await request.json. This takes this request object and gives it in a JSON format for us to read. From that data, we can then say the const items is equal to data.items. Now here's a weird thing that we have to do in our backend. So I'm just going to explain this real quick. We have this. And this is what's being passed in, is it's an array and it has the IDs and the quantities of all the items we want. Stripe wants this. Instead of ID, it wants it to be called price. And this is because it's technically like the price ID from Stripe. And so what we need to do is we need to make an array that looks like this. A simple way of doing that in our backend is I'm just going to say let the line items, because that's also what Stripe calls it, is all these different objects in your array are called your line items. And so we can make a empty array pretty much that I'm just going to type to any to make things simpler. And so I'm going to do a for each going through every single item. So I'm going to say items.forEach. Then we can take the specific item that we are at. So for example, an item like this or an item like this is what it's looping through. And then we can push to this array by saying line items.push. And just like above, we can push it to the price is going to be equal to the item.id, just like above here. And then the quantity is going to be equal to the item.quantity. And so this will get us an array that looks similar to what I have at line 21 here. Now that everything is set up, the Stripe call itself is actually pretty simple. We can say const session is equal to the await stripe.checkout.sessions.create. This allows us to create a Stripe checkout session. And why do we need to make a Stripe checkout session is because at the end of the day, it gives us a URL for the person to check out with. And so in order to get this URL, we can go into create and make an object like this. And Stripe's expecting a handful of things. For example, the line underscore items is going to be equal to the line items array that we made above. The mode is going to be a payment. The success URL is going to be equal to HTTP localhost 5173/success, and then also a cancel URL. So if on Stripe side, they cancel the payment or they go back for any reason, it's going to send them to a cancel page. Then we're going to return a response back to our front end. So we can say return new response. And so because we're going to be using the fetch API to call, that's why we can use this response here. It's what's kind of being expected from our front end. And so response takes two parameters. The first one is a body that's going to be sent to our front end. So I'm going to do a JSON.stringify because we have to kind of stringify our content before sending it to the front end. And we are going to send an object where we have one thing, where it's the URL is equal to the session.url. So the front end will get this URL to redirect. So it's going to get the Stripe session that has been created for the user, and then we can redirect the person to the URL of that session. We can also pass in some other things. For example, the status is going to be 200, which means a good response. Then we can also pass in some headers. For example, the content-type is going to be application/JSON, and that's what allows us to do this JSON.stringify logic here. So now let's get set up with Stripe. You can get started by going to stripe.com and then getting set up by pressing login in the top right. Once you're logged in, it should show a dashboard, which you can press here. On your initial dashboard, you should see a secret key in the bottom right here. Reveal the secret key and click it to copy it. We can then take this secret key over to our server.ts, scroll to the top and put that key where we had that empty string before. This allows our SvelteKit API to communicate with Stripe because it has the specific key to talk to our specific account. But we also need to create IDs for specific products. So we can go over to the products tab on the top here, and then you should be at this page that says add a product. There should also just be an add a product in the top right as well. So we can just do these real quick and let me get a refresher. So coffee, sunglasses, and water bottle. So we can press add a product, name the product coffee or whatever you want, go down and change the price equal to what you want and make it a one-time payment. And then go to the top right and press save product. And so what we can do is we can copy this API ID that's being created. So you should be brought to this page, press copy on the API ID here, and then go to your first page.svelte where you have all these different products. Now we can paste in this API ID, which is going to allow us to associate this actual Stripe ID to coffee, which costs $5. And so now we have to do this for our two other products as well. So I can go in and press add product again. I'm going to make it sunglasses and it's going to cost $10 and make sure to make it a one-time payment. Press save. Now for sunglasses, we can grab the API ID here and then paste it over in our application. We can then add another product by going to the add product. And so this will be a water bottle. It's going to be $15 and it's going to be a one-time payment, and then press save. And then finally, make sure to copy that API ID and paste it over to the ID inside your application. Now, if you save that, everything should be set up, and you'll see that if we add products to our cart, they're now using their actual respective Stripe IDs. And so we're so close. We have our cart ready to go with the correct IDs. We even have the API running in the background. We just need to make it when we check out with Stripe API, it calls that API in the background. So let's go to our main page where we have the checkout with Stripe button. When we hit the click event, so on click, we want to make an arrow function which points to a checkout function, which we are going to make. And so we can say async function checkout. In order to check out, we're going to get access to our cart items. So guys, remember, in order to do that, we have to import get, so we can get the value of a certain store, and then import cart items from /cart.ts. So I'm going to make an await statement, so we can say await fetch. We are then going to fetch specifically to API/Stripe checkout. And then we can have an object for all of our different options for how we want to fetch the API. And remember guys, this is looking at specifically localhost 5173/API/Stripe checkout. Since we are on localhost 5173 on this page, we can do the shorthand syntax like this. The method for how we want to communicate with this endpoint is going to be of post, so it runs that post code. The headers are going to be of content type application/JSON. This allows us to send some JSON code inside of the body. So we can go to the body here. We want to do a JSON.stringify, and we're going to send an object of data. And inside that object, we're going to have the property items is equal to get cart items. Once this fetch statement is done, we can get its value by saying .then, and then getting the return data like this. We then want this data to go into a JSON format. So we can say return data.json. And then with that actual JSON object, we know that if we look back at our server.ts, the response is giving us a URL that's pointing to the session.url. So that .json gives us this object right here. So we can then get that data.url like this. And in order to forward someone to a different window, we can say window.location.replace data.url. Is a very simple way of just forwarding someone to a different URL. And there we go. One last thing is I'm going to show you guys how to go and route to the /success and /cancel routes. So routing in SvelteKit is super simple. We can go in here and make a folder called cancel and make a file inside that folder called +page.svelte. Just to keep things simple, I'm going to go into our other folder here, the top level, and I'm going to copy its styling here, bring it over to our cancel route. And obviously we don't want the product card and stuff like that. So I'm going to delete everything except for this initial H1. And instead we can just say something like, sorry to see you canceled your payment. And so just to explain what's going on here, this is the page that's going to get served to our user when they go to localhost 5173/cancel. It's going to show them this HTML. And similarly, we can go and make a route for a successful payment by making a folder called success, making a +page.svelte, and then we can copy the styling from our cancel page, bring it over to the success page, and instead just say successful payment. Thanks for shopping with us. And this will go to the /success page. All right, now let's go and test out this functionality in our application. So I'm going to add a bunch of different coffees, 1 sunglasses, and then let's say 3 water bottles. Then I can say checkout with Stripe API. It's then sending us to the link that our backend code generated, and then we can put in some test information. The email should be in the format of a real email, but it doesn't have to be like a real thing, so you can just use whatever you want. This card information, the test Visa card is just a bunch of 4242 over and over, so you guys can use that. And so these are pretty much all the different test values you can use to test your Stripe payments. So now we can press pay in the bottom right here, and we get sent to a successful payment page, which is great news. It's actually Stripe itself that's redirecting us directly to this link. So we can be pretty confident that we actually got a successful payment. So as you guys will see here, we have fully processed the payment. So we can go in here and see that everything is checked out just like we'd expect, which is great news. One last thing is that if you guys are curious about how that backend logic is working, because it kind of just, fell into place in a sense, you can go to the server.ts and then you can console.log wherever you want. For example, we can console.log the items here. And so we can add to the coffee, add to the sunglasses, and then check out. We are then seeing a console statement, which is coming from our server because we are posting to this specific endpoint. All right, thanks so much for watching, and hopefully this video was helpful in getting a beginner to intermediate understanding of how SvelteKit works. Feel free to subscribe to my channel if you're interested in content beyond this. Thanks for watching.